So my name is Nancy Leahy Martin, and I work for USAID in the Engineering and Urban Division. Um, and very pleased to see so many familiar faces and very excited to welcome you all to this afternoon's event. This paper competition was conceived 4 years ago. I see Jessica Rosen down the table, who was very involved in starting this up. Um, and the goal was to bridge policy and academia and give a platform to rising scholars in the area of urban poverty. And it's been truly rewarding to see this program grow over those 4 years. And as the competition has evolved, it's really become a truly international competition. So this year, we received almost 100 abstracts from students in 27 countries. I counted this morning. So just, yeah, I won't even name them all. It's outstanding. And, we expect this to grow and grow in future years as well. And that means the broader reach we have, the better quality that we see in the students who submit applications. And you'll see it in this year's publication. It's just outstanding. Um, and actually, I do want to take advantage of the timing of this event to mention USA's new urban policy that was just launched a couple of weeks ago, and there are copies hopefully still out on the table. And it really is important for us to understand what's going on in the field, to hear from these scholars and understand where the new innovations are happening, and bring it back to, I mean, I'm speaking from the USA's perspective, but I think it's safe to say to all of us working in policy and here in Washington and beyond, that we really make sure that our actions are grounded in research and evidence. And so that's really what this event is all about. I really want to thank the partners who have put in a lot of time and resources year after year to make this event a success. First and foremost to the Woodrow Wilson Center, Blair, and especially Allison Garland, who was so instrumental in putting together the publication and today's event, and for letting us use this wonderful space. A big thanks also to the International Housing Coalition, especially Bob Dubinsky and Anjali Bean. Thank you to the World Bank, especially Ellen Hamilton and Guido Licciardi. And a big thank you to the Cities Alliance, especially Renee Homan, who has been a true partner in this event despite the move of Cities Alliance across the Atlantic Ocean to Brussels, where they are hopefully watching and joining us via webinar today. And finally, a very big thank you to our students who came from all over the world today to join us. Caleb Harper, who came from Boston, which is still a trip. Lauren, who came from Paris. Nimesh, who came from India. We also have Raphael Bizio, who was able to join us today. Her paper is in the publication, who came from London. It's so exciting that we're here today and that we'll be able to hear from you and from our expert panelists. We have Ellen Hamilton from the World Bank. We have Fernanda Magalhães from the Inter-American Development Bank, and Tim Docking from IBM. So we're in for a really good event today. So I'll turn it over to Blair to start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, and want to thank AID. Jessica really was an animating force behind this, and Nancy and your colleagues. This has really been a wonderful initiative. This is the 4th year that we've done this, and I think I speak for all of us who have been involved. This is a highlight of the year. It's always exciting, and it's exciting because of the quality of research and the research questions that are being examined, but also it underscores the reality that there is an exciting urban field out around the world. And sometimes when you sit in big buildings like this, you kind of lose sight of the energy that is circulating around the urban theme. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to the panelists. You have their bios, so I'm not going to dwell on it. I want to maximize the time. Basically, we're going to have 3 sets of presentations with commentary. The allocated time is a half hour. Then we'll have questions and answers. But if there are points of clarification for an author, we might insert them before we move on, but we'll see how it goes. So Caleb, you're first.
All right, thank you, Blair. Introduce myself. I'm Caleb Harper. These are my partners, Layla Shakely and Vasco Portugal, that we did this research together. Put this into full screen. Okay, so a tiny bit of background context. What we were most interested in was looking at high-density incremental housing, which there's very little research about, which is just multi-story, multifamily housing that has been changed or is meant or is not meant to change over time, but does. The context that we chose was Manaus, Brazil. We found this paper online, and actually Fernanda wrote it and was part of it, so it's great to have her, and we've had many conversations. She's been an awesome supporter of the research. That some of the original philosophy was that these units would be able to be incremented over time and improved with their own resources. I understand that, kind of changed as the project was implemented, but we found that to be just a really interesting starting point. Little context on Manaus. It's typical of many industrialized cities and also a free trade area in Brazil. So you can imagine that's a polar attractor for migrant workers. As they came into the city, they were drawn into what's known as the agrapes, or the watershed areas, which you can imagine was highly unsustainable. The bank came in together with partnerships in the government of the state of the Amazonas to do an infrastructural upgrade to the city of Manaus, which included water networks, roads, infrastructure, and also housing. So we're going to focus on the housing portion. The little pie chart that you can't read because it's too small basically just tells you that they were given options. The residents were given options when they were removed from their original context. They said you can leave and go back to your kind of original place that your family was from outside of the city, and we'll give you money to do that. Basically the equivalent amount of money. You can move to the periphery. We can give you rent to go buy or money to go buy your own new house, or we'll provide you a very small micro unit inside of the city. That red portion indicates how many people wanted the micro unit inside of the city, which is directly correlating to the fact that that's where their jobs are and their livelihoods. So we thought that was an interesting place to start as well. This gives you probably the worst view that you could, but just to bring it back down to reality on the ground is in the back you see the palafitas, which are floating informal settlements essentially built on docks, and then one of the huge problems that IDB was facing, and also the government of the state of Amazonas, was to rehab these waterways. However, you see this image and you think it's horrible, but then when you go and you survey, which we did very extensively, you find that people take great care and great pride in their own space and personalizing that space. I mean, you can see this great pink house, right? This is not meant to romanticize the palafitas at all, but to show the human initiative and the human capital and incremental development and identity creation in your own space. What this slide is showing you is part of the new constructions with the palafitas. This is really important for our research, which, a lot of these solutions become contextual, and people say one context to the other. You can't, it's oranges and apples, right? Well, in this context, we explored two typologies with the exact same population base, and they were not moved more than 5 kilometers from where they had been living for the last 10 years. So what you're going to see is an application of design that kind of takes context out of the question and really focuses on the spaces that we're creating for these kinds of populations. So to speak about those, typology 1 versus typology 2, a little bit of background too, and I'll get into it. Typology 1 was created as the first, let's say, we would call it experiment. They would say housing, right? And this was, again, multifamily, multi-story, but typologically very different from the number 2, which is a straight stacked, very conventional 3-story walk-up. And we'll get into how those differ. So I guess we can show a little bit of it here. Essentially, that middle story is rotated 90 degrees. So in the typology 1 from typology 2. So what that creates is voids and leftover spaces that actually, invited incrementation, but were not originally intended to do so. And you can see that typology 2 was an instinctual response from the managing body that said, hey, we have neighbors fighting each other, we have poor access to our utilities that we've created. We're worried about creating a slum and investing in future slums by creating this kind of housing that can be changed over time. So what we did was start with both a qualitative and a quantitative agenda, right? So that we could talk to banks with metrics and we could talk to people about space, because one of the biggest revelations of this is space is definitely not a neutral subject, that it's often chosen or spoken to be by relevant parties. So this is just showing you a methodology that we used, and I'd say it's a visual assessment tool that allowed us to gain metrics, and I think that's part of the benefit of this research, is that it does focus heavily on metrics so that we can do comparables. You can see in red on typology 1 and typology 2 where we found incrementation once we visited the settlements. So you can see it's a lot more prevalent on the one that leftover voids. And then in the settlement comparisons, you can see that about 64% of the buildings in the settlement base were incremented in the first typology and 38 on the second. What you don't see is we'll get to later in the presentation is the effect of quality of life. So why did they expand was one of our big questions. First and foremost, and highly above the rest, was home-based enterprise. It's almost always forgotten as an essential component of low-income housing, as it's thought kind of in a monoculture as dollars per square foot. What you can see here between the first typology and the second, if you can kind of see, is because there were voids, they were able to take excess space and create enterprise space. On the second typology, because there was no such space, they moved inside of their own unit. So they're sacrificing basically living space that's already at a minimum, we're talking under 50 square meter, for space to make money, because that's how they eat and survive. And then the second thing I'd like to point out on the Prosumeme 1 side is, and very relevant on one of the lower pictures, is to the high quality that they were able to increment. Now realize that this, along with, well, and that goes to the next, but this is not government supported. This is not only government supported, it's against the initiative of the state of the Amazonas, but they've been forced to take a blind eye. You know, they're not going to tear it down. They know they're not going to tear it down, and in that way, it's successful and able to take root. So you can kind of see the culture that starts to be created outside of these units, right? You create streets that are eventually upgraded into safe places. There were a number of places that our team was not allowed to go, or we had to broker deals with locals that had influence in the drug trafficking, because they thought maybe we were associated with some kind of government problem. That was exclusively in the second typology. In the first, it was all very social in the street scene. So what you can see here is an example of one of those units where they're living in 10% of 50 square meters to economize the other 90. The second point of reference is an expansion is living space, right? Your family changes over time. It either gets increased or decreased, and you want to express that living change both internally and externally. But the bigger difference between Prosumeme 1 and Prosumeme 2 is, because Prosumeme 2 did not have voids to fill, the increments were much more temporal, right? You can see that they've kind of used plastic sheeting, and it's more about crates and leftover materials, because they know that eventually the city's going to tear that one down because it can't be as solid. So if the government was worried about creating slums, the best way that they can create slums is by tightening regulation and by tightening design down, more so than letting people add their own identities and agendas. The third most common addition was for storage space. So this typically was, created below any public element that had, covering. Relatively ubiquitous between the two. However, again, on the more tightly regulated, you'll see it just things piled everywhere, because there is no kind of identity for these leftover spaces. So again, to hammer the point home, when you walk through these settlements, this is exactly the scene, right? Everyone's selling something. Everyone's trying to find a way to feed their families, and to ignore that, I think, is no longer, we can no longer turn a blind eye to that. This is just talking a little bit about quality of life between the two. This is the second settlement typology where they came back and made it a bit more rigid, versus and a somewhat unfair comparison. I will say that, but this was representative of our feeling and the feeling of the people there. Without a doubt, everyone would trade from the second one to the first in a heartbeat, and the first one's smaller. The first one's 52 square meters, I believe, and the second one I get something like an additional 5 square meters. So it's not a space argument; it's a quality argument. So yeah, this is what you see, and this is what we felt. Being able to be in a place where people could change and take identity and take ownership, it was much more safe because they had something to protect. So what we tried to do at the end of this research was come up with maybe like a guideline, you know, or just some points that we could pass on to create that bridge, again, between practitioners, academics, and banks. So one is, you know, consider the form, and consider the form as a strong element to what we might call social capital building. Leaving those voids and leftover spaces, leaving clues for incrementation to control it. Right? What everyone doesn't want is that it would be, you know, people adding, and it becomes another slum. Like we were saying, if you tighten the regularization, that will happen. But if you leave clues behind, I believe it won't. Another is structure is very important. You know, bearing wall versus structural skeleton system. You know, bearing walls are very hard to change, but they do it anyway. And when they do, it will fail the global structure of the system, right? Unless they do it with lintels and they do it in a very engineered way. So I think considering that is very important. Again, income and generation. We in our studies believe that this is the future. You are looking towards high density in every context as the world is rapidly urbanizing. Land is the scarcity. So we will be having to deal with incrementation at higher and higher densities, which you can already see in many other contexts. So one question that we propose people think at the beginning about is what should be built by government and with standards, and what can be left to be built organically. And what that can do is both provide cost savings and provide social capital building that we think is pretty important. So this is by no means a solution, but it is a first pass at saying, okay, there should be a core. That core should contain the utilities and keep utility access out of incrementation areas. Each unit should have a defined amount of expandable space and access to the ground floor. So this was just, you know, kind of a quick mock-up of what they might look like over time. And what you also are creating is a situation very different to, as I go back quickly, the homogeneous, iconic, identifiable low-income housing in a city. This stays the same forever. Whereas, you know, when you look at these more dynamic approaches, this can become middle-class housing. This can provide kind of the ability for social mobility in a city. That's it. One more slide. Bam. Yeah, it's also fun.
Fernanda.
Thank you for the invitation. I think it's for, I would say, a practitioner and a researcher, because I think I've been going from one field to the other. It's very interesting to see something that you were directly involved, because I was directly involved. It was the first project I was involved with the IDB while I was a researcher, because I was a professor at the University of Rio de Janeiro at the time. So it's interesting to see that some years pass by, and I was involved with the first typology. And I left outside. This is a book that we published last year with IDB. That's a kind of a lessons learned looking at different projects. And this picture is Manaus on the cover. This is just a leaflet of the book, and you can download this in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. The link is there. So there is a lot of things here also about Manaus. And I think looking back to what happened at that time, I think the typology was an issue even for the team itself. And I would say that when you work for multilateral, sometimes it's very difficult because you really have different groups of interests. And your client in one hand is the government, but also your client, it's the beneficiary, people that will live in those places. And also you bring your technical background, and your role is how do you manage to face the different agendas that are there, because we have to assume that are different agendas, and you have to be able to really provide some bridges sometimes in terms of the different agendas. So I was yesterday we have this session at the IDB, was a different format, and I have structured my doubts in three main questions, but we've been discussing it yesterday. But looking it back, I think that question of bridging agendas are main aspect of how I think what you have shown from the first solution and the second solutions were different ways of bridging different agendas. Of course, context changes, and one of the points that yesterday have been, they came up from the discussion we have yesterday was that context in the first phase was different than context in the second phase, because in the second phase, the government was feeling that they have been successful. And so the whole setting has changed, and that's something also that working in a multilateral you have to deal with, which is the changes in the political context and changes in the political agents. But there is one question which I would like to come back, having on the background that point of bridging different agendas, which is, are the public programs and policies ready to recognize in their agendas the social, economic, and cultural nature of housing and the role of space design through urban morphology and architectural typology beyond the need of providing shelter or leveraging economic growth? And I think that's a policy question. And I think it's a very relevant policy questions when we are taking decisions, because sometimes I would say that the tendency is to believe that space is neutral and that spatial solutions, they don't impact, let's say, the results. And I think what the work have shown is actually they are major source of impact. Having a spatial background, because my background is architecture and I have been working with planning all my life, of course, I don't share the view that space doesn't matter. I would say that what the work have shown here, and something that we should think about, is that really space is a very important resource. It's a resource that not only connects to social, culture, but economical aspects as well. So sometimes the only way to convince that space is so relevant when you're talking about things is converting it in numbers. That's why yesterday we come up with the idea that maybe a good way of showing the difference for in 1 and 2 is not only showing the images, but also how this reflect in terms of numbers, in terms of the accumulation, the social capital and the financial capital that one situation provides to the second situation. So that's my point.
Caleb, do you have anything you want to add? Sure, Layla.
So the three of us had worked on this together, and I think that point is critical because there's something that's generally not accounted for, and it's the social return on investment when it comes to these typologies. If we look at the two models, the first model was just more expensive if you look at pure numbers in terms of building. The second model was cheaper. But the social return on investment has yet to be measured. So if there's more crime in the second model and it results in more people in the hospital, or let's say less college graduates, what's the social return on investment? And how do we get, from a policy angle, a lot of these institutions to look further than, a mortar and bricks into what the social return can potentially be?
Well, I think just to add, to close it, we also, as Fernanda was discussing, were at IDB yesterday. talking about this issue in a larger panel of people that had association with the project or very similar ones. And the final remarks were that the next step of this research, and it is going forward for all of us involved, is to do this hard versus soft ROI. And that could be reported by job creation and that the numbers associated with the job creation of HBEs or home-based enterprise, and then a lot of the soft angles that Layla's talking about that are just as important, in addition to maintenance. One of the things that we didn't mention, or I didn't mention, I suppose, is because these houses were gifted, right, to these new residents, they had it created a sense of apathy. Especially on the second group of housing, to where they said, well, this isn't really my house. Although they had the title and the deed, and that was very important and very successful, they still felt like the government should take care of the housing and the cost of the facilities management and any communal spaces. But when you see in that first one is the beginning, which is they start to claim the communal spaces. They start to keep them up on their own because they feel like it is theirs and it is their home and they can create identity. I think I'll close with that. Thank you.
We'll go on in a moment to Lauren and Ellen. Let me ask, are there any questions of clarification, not general observations, just any aspect of the presentation that wasn't clear that you want to have clarified? Right here.
Just in general, in the design process, was it a participatory process where you actually had the inhabitants or the end users involved?
In our design process or in the original one?
I guess in the original, the typology 1 and 2.
Maybe Fernanda's more in a better place.
I would say the design was not participatory because it's very difficult with the constraints we have in time to prepare a program, but there was a lot of participation because IDB has very strict rules, and I think most multilaterals, to involve community, and we have social processes to involve the community because there were a lot of resettlement involved as well. So there was a lot of connection with the community itself. But in the book, there is a chapter on the social aspects, so you can look at more detail.
Again, points of clarification. We have a gentleman right here, and then we'll go over here.
Just a question related to selection bias. Could you describe the assignment of the occupants to the different typologies?
They were assigned by time. I mean, at the time that the first one was built, they're separated by years. The first typology is the first years of the project, the second, the next, and there's already a third one coming that's very similar. They are from the same populations, but just 2 years later. Those that held out for a better deal, for example, got the second typologies, which, to be fair, are very functional and very good housing. This is a different kind of, upgrade where they actually have formal utility and formal material. So I don't.
Okay, again, we have 3 questions here. We'll take them and then we'll move on. And just points of clarification. We're getting you a microphone right now.
I was not clear on the relationship between the 3 choices and the original settlement. Is that clear?
Sure. The choices in the very beginning.
Yes.
So basically, when they wanted to do the relocation, they came to each resident, first identifying an address, which is all important, as we all know, and second, saying, we are going to remove your home because it is in a dangerous condition, and it is not a sustainable place that we could upgrade, right? Driven by demolition. And they said, however, which we think is pretty admirable and pretty amazing, is they said, however, you have 5 choices, and whichever one works for you is the one that we will support with the same amount of money. And again, 90% or so said, I have to live in the city and I'll take as small as apartment as possible. The space that was cleared was because it was in a drainage ditch. So no. And they upgraded that space so that the water quality in Manaus is really, really bad. It's like black. So they're basically using that upgrade as a system upgrade for that space.
And then we have
Very
2.
close, was very nearby,
Yeah, it was basically next door.
next door.
Okay, and then the 2 points of clarification on the other side of the table.
You mentioned that the area of this houses was about 50 square meters. What are the representative costs per square meter of this housing?
I don't have the number, no. We may have in the book, but yeah, I don't have the number in mind. But it was average for the 50 square meters. So we are operating what is average for low-income housing for the 50 square meters. So it was just a normal cost.
I could, on the cost thing, if maybe it helps, the first one was quite a bit more expensive. because it contained cantilevers and things like that. So they said at a ratio of half as more expensive. I don't believe that necessarily from what we saw and what we heard. We think it's, maybe a third more expensive, but that should be mentioned.
And the final point of clarification.
Exactly the same question.
Okay.
Trying to understand the percentage of additional cost of typology 1 versus 2. So we can assume about 30%.
I would say so. It'd be
Well,
safe.
we'll return to Q&A, but let's move on, and we'll hear next from Lauren and Ellen.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming here and for inviting me to this seminar. So I will present my paper, which is on progressive planning through extending water and electricity networks in the irregular settlements of Lima. This research comes from actually two questions or interrogations. The first one is about the unplanned character of urbanization in the global south. We usually approach irregular urbanization through the poverty or the illegality, informality angle. The thing is that I was wondering actually about if we really think about unplanned urbanization, what does that mean? And so I hear actually the term irregularity from an institutional point of view, meaning that being unplanned, urbanization is actually out of the realm of official urban planning and official urban norm. And the second dimension of irregularity is the spatial and the morphological one. As we just saw, that the layout and the built-up environment is not actually fit to proper consolidation or proper upgrading. So this irregular characteristic of urbanization has actually pushed the urban actors into a catching up and demand-driven action. The second question was actually about service extension, because it's not because urbanization is unplanned that actually nothing happens. Quite the contrary, actually. Utility firms do extend their networks, even if it's unplanned. So that means that the mechanisms that actually help actors to elaborate their projects are informal or outside the realm of official planning. So until now, since the 90s, insufficient access to services has been mainly explained through insufficient investment and lack of management in public utility firms, and the response has been liberalization and privatization. But this actually omits quite the whole physical dimension of infrastructures, which I'm interested in. Because indeed, on a daily basis, the engineers and the managers of utility firms do install new poles and new pipes every day. So my question was, how do they do that? I mean, it's unplanned, so there is no institutions and there is no proper layout that can help them. So I'm looking actually at the positive attempts of engineers and managers to extend the coverage. So I've studied that in Lima, a very interesting city for its history. Lima has started to grow in the 50s mainly, but the original and interesting history of Lima comes from the reaction of the Peruvian government, because incapable of providing sufficient housing for the new migrants, the government has actually accepted and even promoted and helped state land invasions by the urban poor and the new migrants. And it promoted an integrated physical legal approach to develop the new marginal settlements through the extension of public utilities for public amenities first, and then followed by tenure regularization. So this history has actually inspired the self-help housing trend promoted by Turner, and then land titling policies. So it's a very pragmatic approach of urban growth in Lima. As to utilities, they have been extensively reformed in the 90s. There's a privatization of the electricity sector. So now Lima is divided into two zones, north and south, for one company each. The water utility has remained public, though, under the control of the Ministry of Housing, but it's been extensively reformed to increase its efficiency. So we have now 85% of access to water and sanitation, 95% access to electricity, while actually, depending on the figures and the studies, it can be estimated that between 50 and even 70% of the city actually comes from this process of irregular, unplanned urbanization. So my question is how the utilities have actually coped with the institutional irregularity and the morphological irregularity. So the first issue is the institutional, or the lack of institutions that can actually help actors intervene. Irregular settlements are off the map. There is no data, there's no information, there's no address, there is no registry of the inhabitants, nothing. So the planning rules are irrelevant. And so the actors and the utility staff are actually looking for other institutions to help them work in there. So since there is no operational urban planning framework in Lima, there have been two sources of new institutions. The first one is the national law, and the second one is institutional bricolage, as we'll see. Until the 90s, so the service provision and land titling process were completely independent, and so that was the history of Lima. But in 1996, on the basis of Hernando de Soto's theories, the regularization of land and titling has been implemented, making the official land title prerequisite for accessing basic services. So it's been running on for since then. But since the early 2000s, actually, the government realized that it created a backlog of demand for services, of settlements which could not access services because they didn't have the land title. So in 2006, the government abandoned the land title criteria and created a new tool, which is this certificate of possession, which is a certificate which is directly delivered by the district municipality and which is only valid for requesting basic services without entailing any other property rights. So it's really just a paper saying, okay, yes, you're living here, you do not have any land title, you do not have any deed, but yeah, you're living here, and so with this certificate, you can actually ask for services. The second shift or change in the national law is in 2006 too, but right after. I mean, there's been a change of government in 2006, so the certificate of possession is by the outgoing government, and the change in the national system for public investment has been taken on by the entering government. So the rules and the procedures to actually invest in water and sanitation projects have been eased up to actually accelerate the mobilization of funds for a national program. And for electricity, well, obviously the sector did benefit from the 2006 law creating the certificate of possession, but it's also in 2009 an emergency decree for electrification of marginal urban areas, which has really helped accelerating electrification by clarifying the rules for using the certificate of possession and subsidizing the connection fees. So there's been a combination of changes in the national regulatory framework, which have been very helpful for the utilities to extend their networks, but that was not enough. So actually, the utilities have also adapted their own norms and procedures to access and enter and intervene in irregular settlements. Indeed, to elaborate a project to lay down infrastructure in informal irregular settlements, what the managers and the engineers need actually is information related to the urban layout and to the people living there. This information is actually missing or inappropriate in irregular settlements. And the certificate of possession is not enough either. So actually, the utilities have actually asked the residents to provide a layout plan of the settlements when they applied for connection. So this layout plan is also required now by the district municipalities to get the certificate of possession. So it has become a prerequisite actually to get the certificate of possession. It's a very simple plan with only the roads and the plots. As you can see an example here. It's done by the inhabitants, which means actually that they levy some funds and they actually contract out an engineer or topograph, private one, which will do that for them. So you can see these are actually the shops or consultancy firm, I don't know what to call them, who actually are doing plans for the people, and this is right in front of a district municipality office. So in front of every district municipality office, you have these topographical services. So the plan is actually stamped by the district municipality. It's saying it doesn't have any official value. It's just that the municipality this way says, okay, the roads which are on this map are not going to move. They are actually coherent with the main transportation map of the metropolitan municipality. So the streets are actually fixed. It's not going to move. And so it minimizes the risks of relocation of roads, meaning infrastructure for the utilities afterwards. This layout plan is actually used also now by the inhabitants to get some other public development works done, meaning that actually with this plan they can go to many other NGOs or public finance schemes or even international cooperation to ask for staircase to be built or sustaining walls or retaining walls, sorry, and or I don't know, laying streets, this kind of public development works. So actually all these different actors, NGOs, municipalities, even international cooperation, can align all of the projects on the same layout plan, which in practices then it becomes the map of how the city is and how the city is going to be built up. It coordinates all the independent sectoral interventions this way. It's also a strategic moment, obviously, for the people, because they have to organize themselves, they have to live the money, they have to check a little bit what the topograph is doing. And so it's also where they actually decide where to locate the streets and where to reserve public space for yet to come amenities, like a school, like a sports area, these kind of things. And lastly, it becomes actually an institution in Lima. I mean, it has no official basis, properly speaking, but it's an institution that all stakeholders rely on and that then serves to compensate for the absence of urban plan in the proper sense that we usually hear. So it's very efficient, it's effective, it's cheap, it's geo-referenced because they are really very well done, and it's perfectly fit with the actual environment. The problem is that it's ignored by the official planning institution. It remains at bricolage halfway between formal, informal, and it is not actually properly reused and valued as it could be. So once the intervention context has been set and that the utilities know where they're going to enter and where they are going to work, they have to face the morphological spatial irregularity of the settlements. And this is at the implementation phase. And as several engineers actually told me with a lot of pride, that there are no constraints they cannot overcome. So socio-technical innovations are their thing, and they are actually quite proud of it. And so with a different set of technical innovation, they actually managed to face all the morphological irregularities. So as to electrification, the law that privatized the sector actually allowed to provide with provisional bulk connection. That means that actually there is a macro meter which is put at the last point of the existing network, from which the residents pull themselves the wires, and they put some wooden posts, and they even put some temporary meters, individual meters that you can see on the left, and in provisional streetlights in a way. And then in a second time, once the utility has the capacity to upgrade its own network in a sense, the macrometers are converted into substations, and they put the definitive posts, public lights, and everything. So it's a two-step process by the utility itself to actually connect these settlements. The thing is that when they started to, in 95, 96, right after privatization, when they started to electrify, they've been very quick. So they actually did electrify all the obviously consolidated parts of the city without any map, because there was not this system of layout plan at that time. So it was a simple sketch that the engineers were doing. And so now you have these electric poles that are in what has become a lane or staircase. So they now have actually to relocate them when the municipality asked them to, because they do not have any proof, or they cannot argue why, and they put the poles here. So this is one of the technical reasons why now utilities systematically asked for the layout plan before putting their poles, to avoid this kind of works. And there's also a search for technical efficiency. For example, you see here, these are fiberglass posts that weigh only 50 kilograms, which is actually very convenient because irregular settlements in Lima are on very steep hills and very rocky, what do you say that? Yeah, terrain, thank you. And so here you cannot get a truck or a machine or whatsoever getting there. So that is a constraint that they had to face too. And so the engineers have been looking for new techniques and new technologies to face that. As to water, so Sedapal, the public utility firm, has developed different large-scale programs to extend its network to irregular settlements with the help of international cooperation. So the first program was in the 90s with the help from the EU. It was conceived as an emergency measure to cope with the epidemic of cholera, which started in 1991. But it was rapidly converted into a strategic solution of progressive autonomous network. And here the name progressive is very important because the thing is that so the mini network Sedapal did build for each settlement, there was a reservoir, the main pipes, and public standpipes. The main pipes were put and done in a way that they were actually supposed to be definitive. So in a second time, when the utility did have the ability to connect them to the main network, they just had to cancel the reservoir and connect to the main network, cancel the standpipes to connect everyone in-house. So same as the provisional bulk connection for electricity, this was a two-step process of connecting to the main network. Then in the early 2000s, there's been a condominial water project supported by the World Bank. This is the idea of servicing one block as a unit, as a condominium, with small pipes going through the backyards instead of being straight on the sidewalks, which actually do not exist. And so these are shallower, cheaper, shorter, smaller pipes than conventional ones that can go through very irregular layouts. So that's been really, really helpful. But the thing is that in 2006, the new government did start a national program called Agua para Todos, promising universal and uniform access to water. And this is key because equal access to water is actually silently condemning differentiated provision systems like the one we just saw. So it's going back to a conventional network, but on the other hand, this program did actually really took advantage of the regulatory changes and adjustments that took place quite at the same time. So as a conclusion, in Peru, there's been a very, I would say, original and experimental way of dealing with irregular urbanization. And this has permitted to utilities and the way they actually have managed to both take advantage of the national legal and regulatory framework and also to innovate institutionally, informationally, technically, and socially to overcome urban planning deficiencies and to actually enter and act in irregular settlements. So from this, I would actually get two main ideas. The first one is about the procedures of planning, where adaptation, progressivity, or incrementalism is actually key. The continuous adaptation of the legal framework, we've seen the adaptation and the bricolage of institutions, the new technologies, and also new relations with the population, which they have evolved a lot in the last 50 years. So there's some kind of social learning in planning to actually try to fit with the incremental character of urbanization. So in that sense, I extend the idea of incrementalism to services, not staying focused on housing. And so, for example, starting with collective bulk connections, you can then shift and upgrade and extend in-house the conventional network. And this is for one network, but we can also extend that to the different networks and different public works which take place, which is the case in Lima, where actually you first have electricity and then you have water and sanitation, and then only the staircases are actually done or the lanes covered and everything. So this is actually a way to incrementally, but also strategically and properly, without any incidence of each public work on the other, which can be also a challenge, in a phased manner to consolidate the irregular settlements. And as to the content of planning, the key here is it's very basic, but we just need a grid of roads. We just need roads, actually, and that's what the engineers need. So it's actually what appeared very important there is that it's to preserve the regular rights of way for the utility firms. And this actually also helps us to think about how to actually make room for future urbanization. And just preparing an arterial grid of roads as a local infrastructure corridor, you don't need to put the infrastructures right away. You don't need to put a big, expensive, conventional network right away. But just save the streets, and then actually engineers can work there, and the people can actually also invest in doing themselves the sidewalks or preserving some sports places or cultural spaces. So that more generally, I think that the idea would be to actually maybe think out of the land-focused urban planning approach, which has been quite predominant till now, and shift to mechanisms that ensure public space for infrastructures, and this way, spatially and politically and institutionally, pave the way for an eased up extension of public services in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Ellen?
First of all, this was a great examination of how cities really are built. And I mean, this is a very good example of the way all cities in the developing world are growing. It's not that they're planned and then they're built. They're built and then they're maybe at some point planned. They're not always planned, even after the fact. So that's one of the key takeaways that I have. The other key takeaway, or a couple of the other key takeaways, are incremental, the reality of incremental. This is also the way cities are built. People come, they settle, they build. Ultimately, they start to be included in terms of service, access to services, and then probably somewhere along the line, tenure. As you mentioned, you also have some good examples of the ideas of how DeSoto and maybe the fixation on the title is a bit excessive. Maybe you get 90% of the benefit at 10% of the cost with the certificate of possession or something like that. The reality is that most of the poor are probably not about to go mortgage their properties, and for a variety of reasons, which I won't bother to go into. So I really like the paper, and I completely agree with your conclusion. And in fact, you kind of stole what I was going to say, because what I was going to say is this is great. This is the retrofitting agenda. This is the reality. This is what happens. What are the two things that mayors need to do today to accommodate the people who are going to come tomorrow, so that they can ultimately be retrofitted or included formally back into the city in terms of services? Master planning is not the solution. Master planning, if somebody can show me a city in the developing world where the master plan is useful, please do so. I have been asking around the world for this, and I have yet to find an example. US type examples in Europe don't count. And I think the key is actually the roads. And I would actually push a little bit and say not just the roads. I would say the risky areas. And in fact, speaking back to the first presentation, the cost of resettling people out of risky areas is enormous, far cheaper, easier to keep them out of those places to begin with. I don't know what the unit cost was of the first example, but I would imagine that it was substantial investment by the government in moving people out of these areas, which they had to do because the areas were hazardous. So if you just kept them out in the first place. I would agree it is the network of roads. You don't need to build them. You just need to have the right-of-way and keep the right-of-way free. And if you can do that, then the incremental cost of adding the infrastructure at some point in the future is very little, 1% or whatever, 2% greater than doing it up front. So really great example. Really enjoyed the paper. Has, I think, some really important implications for the way we think about the 60% of urban areas in the developing world that will be built between now and 2030. Most of them will happen informally. And if, to the extent that we can actually, if you will, put some order in the system, stop thinking about trying to do everything, but just actually get the road networks laid out, keep people out of the risky areas, then the cost of ultimately bringing those people more fully into the cities would be much less.
Thank you. Are there points of clarification about the presentation? Yes.
Just a clarification on the plans that are being created by the people. Is that an institution that's supporting those people creating the plans, and are they like licensed and practitioner based, or are those how are those people included in the process? Or I mean, I guess just clarify: was it the institution that was having people in the settlements creating the plans for people, or was it local people and they were selling those plans? Like, what was their motivation, or how was that organized?
I don't know. The thing is that, I mean, what happened for the plans is that the people, I mean, the people in Lima are very, very organized, and you have neighborhood communities which are very, very structured and organized. So they levy some money from every inhabitant, and then they contract out an engineer or an architect or a topographer. They're like private services, like normal ones. I mean, there's no public help, nothing. It's just, I would say, the market. I mean, they just pay for a service they need. I mean, they also, just for the anecdote, like you can also find the layout plans, like pirate cities of layout plans right in front of the National Engineering University for, like, I would say $1 or something like that. And they're really good. I mean, the pirate plans are really good.
Any other points of clarification? Right here.
Curious about the utility fees that are levied by the electric companies and the water companies. How does that work? I mean,
Well,
get paid for the electricity.
yeah, the thing is that there is actually, I mean, a very, I don't know, maybe strong civic sense or something like that. There is no theft, and people actually do pay for the connection fees, and they do pay for then they pay the bill like quite properly.
So no streets, no addresses. How does that happen?
Oh, okay. Well, the thing is that when they actually do in the layout plans, all the plots are actually numbered. So they actually, I mean, it's not an address per se, but they're all numbered. So then they can actually just get their yeah.
Any final points of clarification right here, and then we'll go to the next presentation.
So you're mentioning bulk metering actually for the electric networks, and how does the billing work then? If there is a bulk meter, then there are multiple connections, and so there are agreements between the users that are
Well,
included bulk meter.
it's always the same. Like they have one collective invoice bill, and then they just organize themselves. Yeah, at the bulk meter level, and they just have to organize themselves to pay for it. So that's actually the thing, quite interesting. What the engineers told me, if the neighborhoods are well organized, they will very quickly shift to the individual metering definitive system. If they are not very well organized, they're going to fight over the collective bill. So it's in their interest to get organized to shift to the conventional network. So both ways, it can go quite fast.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we move now to Namesh and Timothy?
Musical chairs, right?
Yeah, some musical.
We should be switching the
They're
tabs.
switching the tags, right?
Very good afternoon to everyone. My name is Namesh Kilam Shetty, and I'm a postgraduate in infrastructure engineering and management. Before starting my presentation, I would like to wholeheartedly thank the Woodrow Wilson Center and everyone else who's given me a chance to come all the way from India and present my work. The aim of my paper actually was to understanding the evolution of slums in Ahmedabad city by integration of various survey data sets that have happened in the city from 1990 to 2012 to understand the growth trends and the various development that has happened. At the same time, the paper also talked about the challenges that took place for comparing the different data sets and emphasizing a need for a standardized and a centralized database from which everyone can work ahead. At the same time, the paper and the final conclusion I could talk about the paper was how this kind of a database could be helpful and really can help the policymakers in evidence-based policy making and planning, which actually forms somewhat as the need of the hour. Starting with the need of the study, I mean, this is something we all know about how many people, about the growing number of population that is people living in the slums, starting from 1 billion people according to the UN Habitat studies. In India itself, according to the 2010 studies by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, around 93 million people live in the slums, according to around 8% of the population. And according to their own projections, this number is expected to increase to around 550 million by 2025. And going by the same, I mean, if we just talk about numbers and numbers, one big question that rises is, I mean, are we as policy planners and urban planners, I mean, doing much enough to look through all this increasing population, and do we have enough data in order to prepare and to plan for this increasing population of slum dwellers, and so that so that we can do something for them. This is something I took from the report of the Committee of Slum Statistics, the Government of India, where they said that the advent of, this is Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewable Mission. Just to elaborate it, this was a city modernization scheme that was launched by the Government of India in 65 cities all across the country, with the sole aim of developing the major infrastructure all across the country. And this is what the report said. I directly pick up the words. It said that the database for undertaking a huge program is grossly inadequate. This program was launched in 2005. Within 3 years, the government itself realized that they didn't have the database to coordinate such a program. Why so? Because of the non-availability of authentic statistics. They had faulty planning, the financial requirements, whatever they had, completely had been underestimated. At the same time, preparation of city development plans can be possible only and only when you have a strong and an extensive database on parameters with respect to the actual number of existing households, infrastructure, availability of infrastructure services, and many others. My presentation has a lot of stories and just question marks and question marks. I'm going to bore you a lot with that. The then President of India in 2009, Mrs. Pratibha Patil, launched one more major program called the Rajiv Awas Yojana. And the major aim of that program was to make India a slum-free country by 2014. I mean, that, that dream obviously was commendable, no doubt. But when we look at it now, I mean, when we do not have any proper statistics on what kind of slums we are having, where we are having other slums increasing or decreasing, how can we even say that a city is slum-free, leave aside the entire country? These were the kind of questions I thought of targeting through my research. And just to continue that, I mean, my main emphasis was, I mean, as I said, analyzing the various slum surveys to understand this evolution, finally to identify the trends and to relate these trends to the implementation of various slum policies that have been implemented in Ahmedabad, as well as various development policies, as well as the development projects. Starting with this, I mean, we all know that slums are indeed a very complicated matter. And the first thing that challenges us the most is defining slums. There are various definitions all across given by many agencies that define slums on their own. But at the same time, we hardly have any basic parameters from which we can say that, okay, this particular definition is something that can be applicable anywhere. What I did, I compared the definitions that have been provided by various organizations to define slums in India. And compared this with respect to various parameters, with lack of ventilation and light, lack of sanitation, access to safe drinking water, structural quality, overcrowding, living area, and security of tenure. What we see among all those definitions is the definition provided by UN Habitat can somewhat act as a benchmark, trying to cover all the basic parameters. The slum census that is being done by the government of India every 10 years through a lot of trial and error since 1951 has finally come to a definition in 2011, which somewhat tries to cover the basic parameters. However, leaving security of tenure. Okay, how much does that miss? I'll just state one number. The 2011 estimates for the UN Habitat, the 2011 estimates according to the slum census for the population in India was 93 million, what I just said. However, UN Habitat, through the same definition and parameters, stated there are 154 million people living in slums in India. So just because of one basic parameter, we are losing, I mean, as an urban planner, this 60 million population has no idea of whatever that's happening. Continuing to definitions of slums, I mean, through every particular area we know has a specific terminology attached to it, and slums are specifically known by those very places, by those very names, in fact, I'm sorry. So, I mean, understanding these names itself becomes also very important to understand those various policies and schemes that are specific to those respective places. I mean, be it chawls in the case of Mumbai and Ahmedabad, bastis in the case of Calcutta, jhuggi jhopadis in the case of New Delhi, or even international like Kachi Abadis, like of that of Karachi in Pakistan, kampungs in Indonesia, and favelas in Rios. All of them have have their respective slum policies, which are based on these particular words and their definitions. And it becomes very important to understand the meaning of these slums and the meaning of these terms and the parameters they cover. As my research is completely based towards the Ahmedabad city, let me just give you a brief introduction. With a population of around 5.5 million and an extended population of 6.3 million, it is the fifth largest city and the seventh largest metropolitan area in the country of India. Over the last 100 years, there were many textile mills that were established in the city during the colonial period, and over the period of time, it earned the nickname as the Manchester of the East. And thanks, especially in the past 15 years, thanks to the many infrastructure projects that have been happening and growing developmental trends, the city was in fact chosen by Times of India, a national newspaper, as the best city to live in India in 2012. But again, one funny thing to notice is that this best city in India has 43% of its population living in slums. So when we have the best city of India having 43% of the population living in slums, I mean, I don't even need to say about the other cities in the country. Talking of the history of slums in Ahmedabad, it's basically started with small-scale unorganized housing localities that, as I said, started where around the textile mills outside the walled city or at the center of the city. Over the period of time, what I was saying about chawls, which are actually a low-income single-room housing units, started developing, especially around those textile mills, and they went on flourishing until 1950s, actually, with many migrant workers coming from other states of the country. However, the Rent Control Act that was established by the government at the later 50s, which somewhat tried to tighten a hook on and try to keep a curb on the rents, because of which what happened was that this led to the discouragement. I mean, the chawls started losing their maintenance because the owners didn't have any much, because the government tried to tighten a hook on the rents that were supposed to be inflicted. So because of that, these chawls started deteriorating very rapidly. And over a period of time, the establishment of many industrial areas, especially in the eastern and western urban peripheries, started leading to occupation of those marginal areas. And later on, with the Gujarat industrial development estates at the south and northern zone, saw occupation of those areas by the slum dwellers. Over a period of time, many policies have been put in Ahmedabad since 1950 to 2012. Be it the slum clearance method, in which the funda was absolutely simple, in which the slums were evicted from a particular locality and were just shifted to some other new place, maybe out of the city, to a basic services of urban poor, where basic infrastructure services and community services were provided to a particular locality. And in fact, even the much acclaimed slum networking project, where development of the slum community and infrastructure services was done by partnership with the private players, with the private MNCs, the slum community themselves, and various NGOs those were working. Few of those schemes have succeeded to a certain extent. However, many of them have failed to a large extent, and the main reason for this failure is because they never had any exact statistics or the exact amount of what they were dealing with. And I think the main reason for the main solution to all this, as I've said before, and I'll be saying again and again, is to have an evidence-based policies, which again can be done only when we have a strong database. Talking of the slum population in Ahmedabad, there's a big story out here. These are the estimates that have been provided by the Census of India between the time period of 2001 to 2011. The Census of India states that the number of slum population has increased from 440,000 to around 800,000 over a period of 10 years. However, as I was again saying about the definitions, the Census of India does not recognize chawls as part of slums. So when Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation did its own surveys, trying to have the slum population, the number completely doubled actually. So the slum population, according to AMC, that is the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, increased from 800,000 in 2001 to 1.7 million in 2011. So I mean, again, at the same time, if you see at the number of slums actually have decreased from 1,081 in 1991 to 708 to 2001, and somewhat relatively increased to 772 in 2011. Okay, as a planner, when I see only at the number of slums, I should feel very happy that the number of slums have decreased to around 300 over a period of 10 years and somewhat stabilized. But one should also look at the total population, which has somehow doubled over a period of time. So this kind of things are really necessary to observe, and all these policies should be, made with respect to these points. If I make some kind of zonal distribution of slum households through the data that is given by the Census of India, I can say that the maximum increase in population has happened in the south and the west zone, whereas the central zone has seen the maximum decrease. Again, at the same time, this distribution itself cannot be assessed for entire analysis because there have been many slums that have changed from one zone to other due to various changes in zonal wards and through the increasing size of the city over a period of time. For my particular analysis, these were the 6 different data sets that I used in order to integrate into a single database, into a single data set. These were some of the 6 data sets that were actually publicly available, and some of them that I individually collected from various NGOs who were working at the grassroots level through various slums at the city. Comparing through all these 6 data sets, all I could get was around 130 slums that could be compared over a period from 1990 to 2012. Starting at a ward level comparison from 1990 to 2012, this was the kind of an Excel sheet I created showing the databases. What you can see is that these were the 4 different years, and I was lucky enough to have 2 different data sets of the same year by different agencies. So from which there were very interesting observations that I really would like to show you. This was the ward level comparison for various wards, as you can see. However, for the same year of 2001, for 3 particular cases, be that of Sahapur is the one in first, the one in Naroda, and the one in Vatwa. If you can just observe the red lines and the gray lines, these are supposed to be the population for the same year. And there is a difference of over 3,000 to 4,000 households for the same locality for the same year by 2 different agencies. This is something that actually complicates a lot of things. If I just move further and somewhat try to show a zone-wise growth in the slum households, and again, I obviously, because I have two different data sets for the same year, so I need to make 2 cases. So with these 2 cases, if you can see, for the case 1, the zone with the greatest increase has east zone, and the zone with the greatest increase for case 2 is central. So for 2 different cases, I have all the 4 opposite answers. Again, as a planner, it becomes absolutely impossible for me. So should I devise some kind of slum policy according to the case 1? That means, should I plan for the east zone, or should I follow the second case, in which should I create some policies, and should I look for development in the central zone? These kind of things have complicated the developmental pattern and the policies in Ahmedabad over a period of time. In order to just continue on my analysis, I went further at a slum level comparison, and this was something I wanted to do actually. I tried to create an ideal timesheet, which I thought which could be used by the government and the municipal corporations at a later period of time. What I did was I tried to integrate all the different data sets, and as you can see, I have put the slum codes of all the data sets, of all the individual data sets that they have been using, so that one can obviously track back to the original data sets. At the same time, I have also created a unique slum code for every slum, on the basis of which this individual unique slum code itself can be used for any further surveys that can be done over a period of time. Using this data that I had, I tried to plot the growth from 1990 to 2012. For those 67 slums that I could particularly compare, for this particular analysis, we could see that the number of slum households increased from 9,400 to around 20,000 from 1990 to 2001. And again, somewhat actually decreased from 20,000 to 19,000 from 2001 to 2012. This is something that actually was boggling even to me in many ways, because this didn't make any head or tail of comparing to all the ground realities that is happening. With various discussions with experts, it was later said that the 1990 survey actually didn't cover many slums which currently were under the city jurisdictions, because the city has gradually grown over a period of time. At the same time, the 1990 survey did not include even the notified slums. So because of that, there has been the 1990 survey showed comparatively covered a very relatively a smaller area, because of which some kind of this data set came forward. So after discussions with various experts, it was decided that the base year, that would be very much better keeping 2001 as the base year, because 2001 was the year when Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation for the very first time did an extensive survey where they tried to cover 1,688 slums and chawls all across the city and somewhat tried to gather data about it. So on the basis of those data, I mean, I could say that the number of slums decreased actually in those particular 93 slums from 41,000 to 29,000, showing a negative growth rate of 2.92%. With this growth rate itself, if I try, I mean, I use this growth rate itself trying to calculate the total number of total slums, so total slum households in the entire city, just to cross check if this kind of analysis was correct or not. And with this growth rate itself, I got the projected slum households for 2012 as 1,80,700 households, which actually to a certain extent was somewhat the same amount, the same number that was given by the Census of India. So I was happy with my analysis. And then using this same growth rate, if I could think, I mean, if I just wanted to see, I mean, by what year, Ahmedabad would finally be called as a slum-free city, and that was nowhere before 2036. As I have been saying again and again, there were many challenges that I had to face in order to integrate those various data sets. The first challenge I had was variation with respect to definition slums that I already explained. If you can see, these were the three definitions that have been used even by Census of India over a period of time from 1991 to 2001 to 2011. There were such huge differences in the parameter itself, trying to demarcate the area. So from this itself, it's unnecessary for me to say what kind of variations one can observe if we're using the same parameters in order to trying to count the number of households for a particular slum itself. The second challenge I had was to the variation in values for the same year in different data sets, again, which I just explained. As you could see, these were some of the particular wards which had huge differences, starting from a difference of 4,000 to around 15,000 households for the same ward. This was a very interesting story. There were many slums which had the same address, the same geospatial coordinates, the same town planning number and everything, yet they had a different name. So when I tried to, again, I went to particular slum communities. I also interacted with many NGOs working in those areas, and they explained me of this phenomenon where what happens generally is that a slum is generally named after a representative or elected headman, and his name is particularly used for a particular survey. So when AMC in 2001 did a particular survey in that area, the name of that person must be Prabhu Nagar or something. So because of that, the name of the slum became Prabhu Nagar Ni Chali. Chali in Gujarati means slum. Over a period of time, from 2001 to 2007, Prabhu Nagar must have been transferred. He went somewhere else. This person went by, another person came in. So in 2007, when an NGO came to survey the same area, this slum had a different name altogether. So when I sit down 5 years down the line trying to compare different slums, different data sets, how difficult it becomes for me in order to identify each slum from one data set to the other. Lack of a common slum code. Again, as I said, all different agencies use different slum codes. It becomes an absolute necessity for all the slums to have a unique slum code and this has to be maintained as a database by the local Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, using which itself all the agencies, be it the governmental, be it the NGOs, or be it even the private agencies, should use this slum number itself in order to track the slums and to have a basic understanding of what is happening there. And another interesting story was an absence of common procedure for rating infrastructure services. Various agencies had their own method of rating infrastructure services. These are the direct images that I've taken from those services. According to this is how AMC, the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, mentioned the availability of infrastructure services. The availability of water supply was just mentioned as yes or no. So for any particular slum, having 10% of available water supply was also regarded as yes, in the same way for any slum which had 90% available water services. So just comparing it to an NGO that is Seva in 2007, where you could see how beautifully they actually at a grassroots level, they have tried to cover each and every percentage, showing the exact reality of what was happening at the slum. So again, at the same time, there should be a common procedure that should be followed by every agency in order to demarcate how exactly are the services, and there's no better way than to show the exact percentage. And finally, as I had again been saying before, there has been a huge redefining and reshaping of ward boundaries of Ahmedabad city over a period of time. So because of which a slum in one particular zone has shifted to other zone and vice versa. So again, as a planner, I mean, as a researcher also, it becomes very difficult for me to identify, and I have to manually look for one slum in two different agencies, trying to identify, okay, this is a particular name, or with help of the address or something like that. Keeping in mind all those challenges, I tried to look forward the possible inferences for all those trends on the basis of the analysis that I had done. And the first analysis that I could come forward was various stalls that were specifically built during the 1950s and 60s have started slowly disintegrating into slums. This is because of the closure of many textile mills and the industries, especially in the eastern part of the city. So what you can see is like various stalls, which were actually some good structures, have started deteriorating and disintegrating into various uninhabitable like areas. The other inference that was clearly observed was encroachment of green belt. There was a green belt. There was a green belt proposed by the Ahmedabad City Development Plan from 1986 itself. But since 1986 till 2013, what has happened is what has happened in the green belts is something that you can clearly see in those pictures. So over a period of time, there has been wide-scale encroachment, and I mean, there has been no one to even keep a check or a control on this kind of encroachment that has happened till now. Again, various infrastructure projects created over a period of time have obviously made Ahmedabad the best city to live in India. However, these infrastructure projects have also led to wide-scale evictions of slum dwellers. According to a report, between 2006 to 2008, around 26,000 slum families were evicted from their homes to other areas. I mean, just for the name of infrastructure projects. I'll take an example of a Sabarmati riverfront project itself that happened between 2006 to 2009. This was the riverfront. On the left side, you could see what was there before the project, and this is what has happened after the project got over. So in order to create this, around 19,000 slum families were evicted at the year of 2007 itself, and were shifted to areas around as far as 16 kilometers away from the base location. What has happened because of this? All those people who had been living, in fact, from centuries in those areas have been broken off from their daily livelihood, from their daily survival and everything. And obviously, various slum policies that I've been saying about, be it with respect to the basic services for urban poor, or even evictions, what they have done, they have cleared a particular area in which slums were there, and what they have built is concrete structures, which again, keeping in mind, however informal a slum is, they have a sense of oneness and a community which somehow actually gets disturbed when they when they are forced to leave their particular area and move to a new place. Even with respect to the basic services of urban poor housing, the government had promised to provide around 200,000 housing units from 2008 to 2014. However, as of now, only 30,000 housing units have been built. And at the same time, there has been rampant and widespread corruption. And obviously, there was also an interesting phenomenon which I was just explaining during lunch. Many of those dwellers who have been allocated houses in these kind of units, around 60% of them have been found to be rented to other people. What happened was that those slum dwellers couldn't find it comfortable enough to leave these particular areas and shift to a new place, to a new building having lifts and proper electricity services and everything. They in fact preferred to live in the same place where they belong to, and were obviously ready for any kind of development in that particular place itself. This again advocates the very point of how important it is to leave aside evictions and think of community development in the same area of where slums are originally located. Just in order to, this is the last part of my research, just in order to confirm those possible inferences and everything, I selected some case studies and individually went to those slums to see if what my inferences were really holding true. And these were some of the very, interesting studies that I got found of. This particular slum called Vasant Nagar Na Chhapra is located at the North Zone. One interesting thing to observe is that this particular slum saw a 1,567% increase in the number of households from 2001 to 2012. Why? Because if you can see in the middle portion, there was a huge open area, just in and around the slums. So because of which because this was supposed to be a green belt, and in a period of time, also there were some many industrial areas that were located nearby. So there has been, so because of that, there was illegal occupation. Of those particular areas by slum dwellers. And at the same time, over a period of time, what you could even see is that even the infrastructure services in those particular areas started developing. And in fact, it was developed by the slum communities itself. I mean, because it was so accessible for them, because it was near to the industrial area, I mean, it had a lot of green spaces somewhat, so that obviously they can always expand. So by they themselves took the initiative of developing the infrastructure services at that particular place. This was the slum number 2 I visited. This was one of the perfect example of where a slum was completely evicted for the development of an infrastructure project. I mean, this particular slum at the west zone was exactly falling in way for a bus rapid transit corridor, or a BRT corridor, what we tell about. So for that, around 79% of the slum population, the slum households were evicted. However, at that period of time, considering the fact that it was at the central location of the city, the population slowly started increasing, where most of the people started, I mean, most of the people living in those areas work at street level or in many informal activities. I mean, working as security guards or peons or even cooks at the nearby many residential areas that were there in and around the city. And finally, the third slum, which was at the south zone. This was one more area where again a large-scale eviction took place for the redevelopment of a lake, which you could see in the central of Google Map image. After a period of time, after the lake got redeveloped, I mean, those people who used to live in the slums saw that there was a huge potential for income with respect to the number of tourists who come to the lake. So again, they started settling to a new place which was just nearby to the lake itself. And all those people, they started, I mean, having those some kind of informal occupations, as selling as hawkers and various, I mean, selling various stuffs in and around the lake itself. I mean, integrating all of these, what I could really say was that finally, in order to have a policy, in order to have an evidence, in order to have a strong data set, what is really necessary is to have a central database needed by the municipality and the government to be followed by every agency. In addition to a distinct slum code which has to be used by every agencies for service, there also needs to be a presence of a slum details to be kept out in the public domain for all researchers. I mean, there was one thing which I actually personally experienced. When I started my research work, I found out that there were over 20 survey sets that have been done from 1990 to 2012. However, out of 20, all I could get was 6. The remaining 14 have not even been released to the public as yet. All of them it's still under the jurisdiction of the government and the local municipality, and I have no idea what they want to do, still keeping it with themselves. As I said, all these policies need to be based on the growth trends of areas, the growth trends of the slums itself. And once you create policies, you create plans on the basis of the growth trends, on the basis of the development that has been happening at the grassroots level, then only you can actually say that, okay, you can think of something that would address the solution for that particular slum. Thank you.
Timothy?
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Is this on? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is a very fine set of work from everybody, and I guess batting cleanup here, I'll try to articulate a few of the points amongst the papers. But first off, with Nimesh's work, I had the advanced copy and read through it, and gave it some thought before this presentation. And I think I'll choose to try to focus on about 4 of the premises, of the focal points of his research, and try to just comment a little bit on that, and perhaps at the end try to suggest some perhaps future research areas, since I know Nimesh wants to go into perhaps get a PhD in the same area as well. So, it's very evident that the importance of data in this is a premise that Nimesh has throughout his work, especially at a time when it's more pervasive than ever. And what I'm talking about is the explosion of data, something we talk a lot about within the IT industry. That's the first point. Not only is the importance of data really highlighted here, but the importance of good data. And I think his comparative work, real good, rigorous, digging into these studies and pointing out the failures, perhaps the inconsistencies in these is another point that I'll return to. The focus on slums, an area all too often overlooked in this demographic. Us who are familiar with the development literature, perhaps, focused on this. But I think generally, it's an exploding, breathtaking problem, an issue that really comes through in this work, I think. And then the fourth point that I'll return to is his return to the need for what I think he calls evidence-based or fact-based or data-driven planning by policymakers in the developing world. And this is a theme, again, in this era of big data analytics. In fact, I think it's one of the subtitles of this, of our session today, is really remarkable, and I'll try to return to that. Before I do, though, I should probably mention a couple disclaimers. I really know nothing about urban planning, slums, or a lot of the things which these experts have been referring to. I suppose as a second disclaimer, I have to admit I'm a political scientist by training, and so a lot of my analysis will sort of go to the politics that may be perhaps behind some of these things. So these four areas I'll try to just return to just real quickly in reverse order. So the importance of this work, I think, the urgency of this sort of analysis, I think, is really pointed to in its introduction, which Nimesh refers to, which he says, globally, one thinks, one sees the statistics, there's 1 billion humans living in slums across the world today, and that number is set to double by 2030. And that 2030 figure struck me because if you follow the news from this town and from our big institutions around here, 2030 is also the date when poverty is supposed to come to an end, right? The end of extreme poverty has been slated to occur, or a goal for it to occur is 2030. And so there's clearly some discrepancy, some direct opposition in these things here, in these trends. I think we're all focused on urbanization now because I guess it was this year, or perhaps our friends from the multilaterals know the date of when we tipped the balance from rural dwellers to urban dwellers. Was it this year? But we point to 2030 as a time when that number of urban dwellers should be at about 60%. 2050, the percentage of people on Earth living in urban settings is going to be about 70%, or over 6 billion humans. So this really is urgent that we talk about this. 60 million new urban dwellers settle every year, 180,000 a day. So, I think about this in terms of natural disasters, another focus in the front of our minds given what's going on in the Philippines right now. I think a special light was shed on natural disasters and the risks they pose with the Haiti earthquake. But since then, a lot of new discourses have emerged. Resiliency is one that dominates in this field, the modernization of old infrastructure. All of these things, us in the room that really focus on international development pay attention to, but maybe surprisingly, those in the business community do as well. And I'll mention that in a minute. But at the World Bank, I think the Cities Alliance was referred to, and that's an organization which is really focusing on slums and doing some interesting work. At the IDB, I think the Emerging Sustainable Cities Initiative is an interesting one to look into if you all haven't already. And Fernanda and I were talking about that over lunch today. But the Asian Development Bank, some of the other multilaterals have cities projects as well. It's quite common. So the donors have gotten engaged, and I expect this next round of Millennium Development Goals will reflect, this issue of urbanization and some of these other themes I just touched on, and which I think will also impact, our view of slums and some of the approaches, the policy approaches going back to those. The second dynamic I suggested also is sort of corporate interest in this area. At this time as well, I think now perhaps more than ever, we hear the need and appreciation for, if we have these massive challenges, if we have sort of an inverse in some developing areas like Africa of investment. I think in the 90s, in the early 90s, the percent of investment going into sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa, was about 80-20, 80% donors, 20% FDI. That number's been flipped on its head. And so I think that dynamic combined with dwindling donor budgets and really increased growth in these areas, economic growth, at the same time in mature markets where we see stagnant growth, is driving companies like my own into these frontier markets, into the intersection between development and business, and in some interesting ways, I think. And we are being called to think of things like slums, and we are being driven to think of things like slums for several reasons, because there's business there. This dialogue about the bottom billion perhaps is come and gone to some extent, but still, I think some markets, the cell tel market, the telecommunications market, is really found ways to extend to the bottom billion, sometimes even in these areas of what one would assume would be great, not good markets, in the slum sorts of environments. But corporations also, I think they appreciate the importance of social license, of getting into these areas, and of economic growth and improvement of societies. I think the way that corporations look is they want to create innovators. They want skills to grow. They want to see economic growth. And so all of these things sort of come together and are important. So, I think just to sort of bring these brief remarks to a close, in referring directly back to the paper, I think what Nimesh does well is I think he really points out the challenges of collecting these sorts of data in an area like where he did his research. But again, I applaud the rigor with which he applied to it. And I've done this sort of work myself, not in slums, but collecting information and trying to synthesize it from discrete sources, which aren't reliable, and it's not easy. But I think there also needs to be a realization that we can't be deterministic about the data that we are able to gather either. Is this data reliable even after you're able to sort of synthesize several parts of it? Probably not. And there's a lot of reasons for this, and this is where I put my political science hat on. I think everyone is familiar with the politics of collecting census data, both by the counters, from the counters, and those who are counted. Everyone has their reason to or not to be counted and accounted for, and that dynamic really should be appreciated. The physical environments of these areas and the challenges of collecting data is really quite something. The lack of organization, records, cadasters, permits, licenses, all these things really, in some ways, lead one to conclude that perhaps one will never get real good data through the traditional ways of counting these dynamics. So then, where do you go? Is this as good as it gets using our traditional means? Perhaps, and therefore, and I think there's a growing appreciation, trying to bring together some of my comments here on the new potential being presented by big data analytics. And so I would say, Nimesh, in your next phase of your research, to consider the use of mobile, which I understand in India is quite high penetration, even in these areas. How does one leverage social media to really take advantage of that, to reach some new insights in this area? And then, and this is my last remark really, is to, looking at the micro, applying it to the macro, given the trends that we see and the challenges, the breathtaking challenges we face, is really to try to generalize to policymakers, to development banks, to the private sector, and trying to find synergies that that we can rally around and try to improve some of these conditions. So I think, Blair, I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's start off with, if there are any points of clarification, we should give an opportunity for those to be raised. We'll get you a microphone, though. We're getting it right now.
Everybody hear me?
No, it's also for the
Webinar.
for the webinar. We're having a mic problem, so.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
I didn't understand the population chart about a third of the way through. I was looking for some evidence of, it was very colorful. And it was, no. It had marks all over it, but I
Just a
couldn't
second.
figure out what it was telling me about concentration of slum
one?
dwell. No. It was a, no. It was a map kind of a chart. I said chart. I lied. It was a map. No.
Oh, that's it.
Keep going. No. Better to start the beginning. That one.
Okay.
What is that telling me about the distribution? What, if anything, is that telling me about the distribution of slum dwellers and
Oh, no.
where they're located? And it didn't match the area I'm looking at.
Okay.
Doesn't match the numbers in terms of comparability. So relative densities of slum dwellers versus density of overall population would be an interesting thing to know from that map.
Okay, I mean, talking of this map, actually, this was just a basic map trying to, I used this map just to show the boundary of the slum city. Yeah, actually.
Okay, fine.
Okay, any other points of clarification? Okay, I think we'll move to a general discussion, and maybe I'll kick it off. I'm very interested to hear in very different ways and very different contexts, but each of you speak about the challenges of identity formation. And identity formation doesn't always come up in our discussion about economic development. And I'm wondering, based on your field experiences, how do you see, first off, who gets to decide shape identity? We see in the last instance, various international and government agencies trying to impose an identity on community. We see in the first instance, we see dwellers establishing their identity by the way they're changing their physical environment. And in the case of Lima, we see certain kinds of identity arising out of shared use of utilities. So who gets to shape identity? But more importantly, how do we incorporate thinking about the shaping of identity into our understanding of economic and community development? And why don't we just, maybe Caleb, you're first, you and your colleagues can take a first crack at this.
Okay, identity, right? Super important for us. Creating places that are suitable for the creation of identity. And I think for us, we would say that's intimately tied to space. And it's intimately tied to engagement with a physical space. And putting forward those things that they value, the individual person inside of these settlements values that you may not value, right? This is where they express what is important to them, what is important to their community, how they want to be seen by the outside world. I mean, they put a lot of investment, especially in the slums, of uniquely identifying themselves. So I think there is like a capital there that is rarely harnessed in any of this low-income housing development that becomes formalized. And in that way, we are only creating, let's say, a more sterile environment. And in that sterile environment, there's less chance that collisions can happen for innovation. So I think you can bank on, when you give a person a space for creating identity and expressing that, and you support that you will also support jobs, you will also support social growth in the community, and overall resilience.
Lauren?
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that actually Lima is a very specific case, I think, but bringing services, whatever is the land status, bringing services, the states shows and tell the people, okay, you're part of it. You're part of the city. You have the right, not only the right, but also the legitimacy and access to public services. And networks is also something which is very part of integration. I mean, the network, the water network is unique. It's a metropolitan system. So if you're part of it, you're part of the city. So you have legitimacy and you have right, and you can actually start working on it. So in Lima, there's been, for the last 10 years, I would say, after the terrorist period and everything, a complete shift in the identity of the city. You have the center of Lima, which is the historic center, and then you have the three cones of the city, north, east, and south. And it used to be called barriadas or marginal settlements. And every decade, the name has changed, and now you have Lima Center and the new Lima. And the new Lima is the north cone, the east cone, and the south cone. And these cones are actually now related to the bus rapid transit system. They have huge malls. They have the best industrial zones and everything. And so they have actually incrementally started an economic activity which is really based on the idea that they are part of it and they are actually the new Lima. And this has been done, well, obviously by the people, but also because the state did accept and said publicly, you're legitimate in being here through network extension.
I would just like to compliment Caleb's point just by just giving an example. Taking the case of Dharavi in Mumbai, which I think most of us know as one of the largest slums in the country, in the world, in fact. Today, Dharavi emerges has a multi-billion-dollar industry with various small-scale, manufacturing units that go on inside the slum. What has happened in the due course of time, where the local developmental authority, instead of evicting those people, thinking of removing those particular slums and instead creating big huge structures, they thought of developing some kind of access to the slums that were already there. Access in terms of providing services, access in terms of providing employment, access in terms of providing community development, which in a way made the slum dwellers aware by themselves, and by that itself some sort of created an identity for them in many ways. So I think, according to my thoughts, an identity for these people, an identity is possible only when a development is done only at the grassroots level itself, instead of thinking of policies or programs that take with that that take of a slum as any particular entity. We think of evicting it to some particular different place or an area, or like we think of even like as a physical project altogether. What is more necessary is thinking the life of the dwellers, and how you can enrich the people. How you can enrich the life of those people who have been living in that particular area, and in fact supporting them for them to continue in that particular place itself.
Open questions, comments, observations. We'll give you a chance, but I want to be sure there's somebody, okay, in the back.
Thank you very much
It's on, just speak into it.
for excellent presentations. By the way, I happen to work in Republic of Yemen's informal settlement project. And from that point of view, I have two questions. If it's not exactly within your research, but if you can give us insights on this, appreciate it. The first question is for the first presenter. You mentioned the importance of the sort of leaving the room for the community itself to flourish its identity. Here, what I can see, for example, my counterpart in Yemen, say municipal government, their worry can be that, well, great, we leave a little bit of room then to the community itself to flourish, to the institute upgrading and so forth. However, how can we contain the situation such as they keep expressing their identities, right? Like they keep expanding because we left the room to them to express themselves and so forth. So would there be any advice from your point of view that what policy municipal government can take to make sure that, yes, the community takes the ownership, they can live there comfortably, they express their identity, yet the area is contained, still the area doesn't keep expanding. So that's my first question. The second question is to the second presenter. So what happened in a minor scale is Yemen's context is that the moment which where the public service became accessible to that, say, very low income, impoverished community, then the value of that community's place goes up. And then it happened in few cases that then those who can afford to the going up rent or basically value of that area as a consequence of public service connection starts to grab that place. So if you have insight about how to prevent such situation, appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so what you brought up is a huge concern in the area of especially the hybrid face of, let's say, formal development and informal development, which is what we're really interested in. And that is the fear that if you give an inch, they take a mile, right? And that you would be, the term they throw around is slumization, you know, or financially supported informal development. From our perspective, when this needs to be conceived, incremental housing and incremental addition over time is fundamentally never going away, and it's never gone away. It's always been there. So to recognize it upfront in any formal development project and say, okay, you know, how do we capitalize on this, and then how do we set natural limits for it? The problem is when what happens now, which is they turn a blind eye, right? They're forced to silently consent to this going on, and it was never designed for. So that creates a lot of problems. So I would say in the initial phases of designing formal housing in the future, it must be said, okay, what is the infrastructure that we provide? You know, what are the essentials that have to be there, and how does that infrastructure clue or guide development in the future in a positive way that takes advantage of the human capital? I mean, because there's a lot of it there, and it's quite interesting.
And to piggyback on Caleb's response and to give you a concrete response for your question, I think that's in the hands of the designers. We all have architectural backgrounds, and that's why policymakers and designers need to work hand in hand, because what we found was in the first model where there was opportunity for incremental expansion, there was controlled expansion as a consequence. In the second model where there was no room for incremental expansion, public space such as alleyways were taken by the biggest man on the block. So that's a design question that we think there could be clear answers for.
Yeah. Well, it's a tricky question of gentrification and how we can maybe limit that. I mean, I couldn't say about the Lima case because people are actually really well. I mean, they build their own house. They actually invaded the land and then they build their own house. So they usually stay and they're very staying there. But the thing is that it's very difficult question. I mean, I may answer your question with another question. Is it a problem that actually people move out? I mean, they make a profit on that in a way. I mean, they will just sell the property that they've built with a profit margin. I mean, of course, they will maybe surely live in another slum with not that much access to services and poor housing and everything. But meanwhile, they did make money. And so they could pay. That's what I saw from a project in Morocco. Like they could this way pay for a hospital bill or for education for children. And I mean, the thing is that if you actually put very strict limits, like because it can exist that you actually force people to stay for 10 years if they want to have access to services, you can do this kind of thing. But I mean, we're talking about irregular urbanization. So anyway, they're going to sell. I mean, we know that we actually cannot control what people want or do. So, I mean, that's... Yeah, I couldn't tell you, but I think we should not, I mean, why the poor cannot also speculate?
Okay, other general, we'll take the gentleman back there, then we'll come up here.
Thank you again for a great set of presentations. I also had two questions. I was wondering for the third presenter if you could sort of go into how you envision this sort of national data set sort of taking place. Sort of what stakeholders would you want involved? What's perhaps the role of multinationals in sort of helping to incentivize that move, for example, if it's not already a locally driven process? And then for the first team, I really liked sort of the brief preview you gave of how you sort of plan to measure both the economic capital of housing as well as the social capital. And I was wondering if you could go into how you sort of plan to go ahead with measuring, especially the social capital of a community. Thank you very much.
Okay, to reply to your question, I'll just break it in two parts. First of all, in order to create an integrated database, I think the best and the only possible way is to have an effective coordination between various agencies. And when I speak of agencies, that has to be the local municipality, that has to be that has to be various NGOs who work on slums actually at a grassroots level, and even those elected representatives who are there at every slums. Now, when I talk of NGOs itself, I mean these particular NGOs have a certain particular area in which they work, and they know exactly what happens in that particular place, and they even know the representatives. Now, when the Census of India comes for surveys at a city level, it obviously may not be having the resources nor the necessary contacts. I mean, it may be giving contract to a third party or a third agency, which may be again subdividing into different people who may or may not give the correct picture. I mean, again, at the end of the day, if there is a perfect coordination between all these different agencies, starting from the top governmental level, to the people who have been elected as the leaders at the particular slum community, I mean, this can lead to a certain smooth flowing of data from the lowest to the highest level. I mean, from which I think it should be easier enough to create a good database. Talking to the second part of it, how corporates can be involved in this kind of development. I had just talked in my presentation about the slum networking project. I mean, just giving a brief introduction about it. This was a project that was conceptualized somewhere between in the late 1990s, where certain companies actually based in Ahmedabad and other cities in India somewhat kind of adopted a particular slum. And what I meant by adopting is that they gave some financial support to an NGO who was working in that particular slum. So with respect to that of the contribution given by the big company, through with the help of the NGO that is actually working on the slum, and also through the individual, how should I say it, the individual participation and the interest shown by the slum dwellers itself, led to huge success, in fact, in various developments of that particular slums that were targeted. However, unfortunately, I mean, whatever it happened, I mean, over a period of time, those particular companies itself, which had been initially financing, I mean, for the development of those slums over a period of time, just initially, in order to gain a corporate in order to get respect in terms of the corporate social responsibility. However, I mean, start losing interest because there was no financial support being shown by other agencies. I mean, I feel that at this time, if in some way, if this can be revived again, I mean, over a period of time, maybe through tweaks and modifications, I guess, I mean, obviously, cooperators do have a very big role to play in development of a particular slum.
Yeah, and I'd just comment on that as an employee of a small multinational IBM. Right, so people are generally familiar with corporate social responsibility ventures in this space. But what I would put forth is that the new model that should emerge is one where we see, shared value. We see a business model overlaid on a social ill to see mutual gain on both sides. I would put forth that that's a sustainable model. Perhaps it's a new model with not a lot of reference cases that we can point to around the world, but I think that's what's being considered. Enlightened self-interest, whatever you want to call it. It gets to some of the points I was trying to make here, because so often these CSR initiatives do good, but they aren't sustainable either. So even in terms of skill development, of economic growth, creation of entrepreneurial classes, I think that's in everybody's interest and should be encouraged.
Right. So to follow up on the how to measure social capital. So coming out of the conversation that we had yesterday, I can give you an idea of where we're headed. It's a little uncharted for us. First realization is, right, hard return on investment's easy because it happens all at once. You know how much it cost, and you know how many units you built on the ground, and all of that. So this other is the factor of time. So I think that's the first obstacle that we must be able to overcome, either retroactively or proactively at the beginning of new projects. But I think there are a few indicators that we're already postulating, which would be property value increase, decrease over time is intimately relatable to desirability of living condition. So are these areas stagnant forever? Do they have gain? Do they have loss? Obviously, that's intimately related to crime statistics, which I think is another soft number that's, oh, it's a hard number that's available, but it's a soft cost of this kind of project. And I think to actually tie back the conversation, it is also in the creation of sustainable livelihoods is what we talk about, right? So the quantifying of home-based enterprise, the quantifying of how much money that brings into each family, at what proportion that relates to their annualized income, I think starts to justify creating some of these residual spaces. It's not just selling things; it's also renting rooms, as was brought up very poignantly in the Indian context, but also. I think it's pretty much global. The first thing they add is either a rentable room or they add a store to sell something. So you could actually do an economic benefit per square foot of all sustainable livelihood endeavors. Relate that to the initial cost and then start to see offsetting measures. So I think that's where we're going.
Okay, we'll take the two questions up here, come up, and then you'll have the last question. Both of you.
Thank you. I had a question about Lima, and specifically about electrical connections. What is the connection cost like? What kind of capacity? Is there provided enough capacity for every household to have refrigeration and air conditioning and such? And the reason I ask is because in many areas of the U.S., it's becoming the case where the connection cost for new construction to the electrical network is actually comparable to the cost of an independent solar electric facility, and I'm wondering if it's getting close to that in Lima.
And before you answer, we'll get your question.
My question, I have two also, but one is about Lima, and it relates to a comment Ms. Hamilton made about the fixation on title as opposed to the usefulness of the certificates of possession. And my sense of DeSoto's work was to enable the people to gain the wealth dynamic of property ownership, and I'm wondering if that is lost with the certificate process. You did say that why shouldn't poor people speculate, and I'm wondering if there's a difference between those who have a certificate of possession versus those who have title to the land as it relates to their ability to speculate. My question for, let me see if I can get this right, Namesh, is a question. My work is in complexity science, and scale is an important dynamic there. And I'm wondering if there are some contextual factors of the next level of government or the next level of context that limits the ability of the level at which you are working to adjust. That is to say, Laurie talked about the value that the government assigns to the people who are participating in this process and how freeing that is to their willingness to participate. So is there some difference or some contextual issue, cultural, political, economic, whatever it may be, about the next level of emergence, if you will, that affects the attitude toward conforming data at the level at which you are operating?
Why don't Lauren and Nanesh answer these questions, and then we'll take the last question. So go ahead.
Okay, well, as to the cost of electricity, I'm sorry, I do not have the figures in mind. The thing is that there's a very specific weather in Lima, so there will never be any need for air conditioning. So that's definitely not an issue. And neither actually really heater. I mean, it's kind of, except for months of fogs and stuff, but like the temperature is quite moderate all the time. So that's not really an issue. And like the issue of cost is not, it's not really an issue. Neither for the people or the engineers. Nobody did really mention that as an obstacle or anything as to a connection. As to the question of title, well, actually, the benefits and the wealth that actually people are supposed to get from having a land title, it's been widely criticized, and especially in Lima's case. So there are plenty of studies showing that actually having a land title does not really help people getting a loan from the bank or this kind of thing. So, like, first of all, the wealth, the additional wealth that the people are actually supposed to get from having a land title, it's not that well proved in Lima's case. And as to the difference between land title and certificate of possession, actually, I mean, the people actually, the inhabitants of irregular settlements, they actually do not really care that much about the land title. So they do everything they can, and they're ready to invest and to put money for doing the layout plan, for getting the certificate of possession, because that is what will help them get water, electricity, and also then the staircase and the retaining walls and everything. So they are really willing to get involved for that. The thing is that the land titling process too is actually completely, what's the contrary of bottom up? Top down. Thank you. So it's the central administration in charge of land titling, which is going to decide in which settlement and how and when they're going to get the land title. So the people are actually completely out of this process. So it's actually not. I mean, it right now, since 2006 at least, it's not that much now a tool of urban development for the people.
Nimish, and then
I'm actually sorry, I couldn't get your question exactly. I mean, do you wanted to ask? I mean, what would be the exact method that should be followed by a by an organizing agency or by a government, for?
I'm asking for your perspective
Okay.
on the context, on the constraints imposed by the context in which you are working to developing the kind of data set that you want to develop. If, for example, there is no value placed on the people who are in this situation, and there's political or economic benefit to the status quo, then you're not going to get a lot of cooperation for conforming your database. And so I'm trying to shift the cause-effect thinking to
Yeah,
the
I get
next
your point.
level of constraints and what those people are seeing and thinking about when they're looking at the populations that you're trying to serve that limits the ability or the emergence of a conformed database.
Okay, I mean, what I can think about is, I mean, one of the main reasons why, in fact, slums thrive in like major big cities in India is because they act as a political vote bank. I mean, slums are a place where, I mean, most of the, I mean, in fact, 90% of the politicians cash in to gather as many votes as possible in order to like get selected as the elected representatives. And because people in the slums are mostly illiterate, I mean, they do not have much, much knowledge of outside. It's somewhat very easy. As a politician, I go to a slum, I give them a $2 note, a 100 rupee note, and then I say that you vote for me. I'll give, just in terms of promises. I'll give you a $2 note. I'll promise you that by like if you elect me, I'll provide electricity for the entire area in the next 5 years. I'll do this, I'll do that, and that becomes, I mean, very enticing for for a person living in the slum, just to rightly vote for him. So, I mean, with respect to political agendas, it becomes very necessary for, it becomes very necessary for them to keep in track, not exactly keep in track, to have an idea of, to see how many, to keep a track of exactly how many slums are there and what kind of people, how many people are there. Because somehow, although in a negative way, but it's obviously looking at an advantage. It's looking at they're looking, trying to make the most advantage out of it. Looking at the other side of it, what I can say is that, these slum communities obviously have a major role to play in some way or the other. When I talk about development, when I talk of the entire growth of the city, somewhere down the line, obviously, I took the case of the Dharavi itself, where, as of now, this at that particular area is one of the highest gathering income generating sources in the entire city. So, that is, if when that can happen in the case of Mumbai, then why can't it happen in the other cities of India? If not even India, why not even in the entire world? So, this is something that one can think about just with the case of ideal governance. When you can think of exact policies or schemes that target the slum populations exactly in the way that that will help them, come out of whatever problems that they have specific to that particular area, and not speaking generally. That will give them a miles good of obviously and advantages for them to come out of whatever problems they have, and in fact, allow them to become a part of the very city of obviously the rest of the city, when obviously the rest of the city considers them to be a completely isolated or a separate place. I hope I'm able to answer your question in some way or the other.
and we'll give you the final question.
Yes.
A question I would say probably directed mostly to the second presenter, but I would be curious to hear opinions from the others as well. I work for the city of Dakar in Senegal, and I'm helping the city to prepare to launch a municipal bond. And as part of our overall planning, we looked at the concept of needing to have a comprehensive master plan for the city, not only for an investment project, but in general. One of the problems that we have is that the utilities, the water and sanitation, are provided by the central government, not by the municipality. And so there's a disconnect. The city might want to have additional housing for the urban poor, but providing the services and the utilities is difficult. And I wondered whether there are best practices in order to deal with that when there are services provided by not the same provisioning source as the housing itself. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if there are best practices or not. The thing is that, I mean, in Lima, so there's a metropolitan municipality for Lima, and then 42 district municipalities. So the water utility is actually indeed depending from the central government. The thing is that since the 50s, 60s, all the urban policies have been conducted by the central government. So the national law prevails, and it's been only for a few years that the metropolitan municipality has, the staff has changed. I mean, there's a new mayor, and so she's actually trying to get a new urban plan for Lima, which has actually in practice not existed for decades now. And the thing is that actually, that's what they told me, that they are stuck. I mean, how can they actually build an urban policy if they do not have, not control, but at least some kind of view on the water policy? So they've been claiming for at least having a seat in the board of the water utility, but the state said no. So that is indeed really an issue of how you actually get to different actors with different, I mean, it's not getting different actors with different logics around the table. This is a very classic governance issue. But it's more like when you have different controls over these different parts of the urban fabric and urban planning. I would tend to say that actually maybe in that sense, privatization actually may be a solution. I mean, that's what I saw from the Delhi case. My PhD is on both cities. And in Delhi, actually, the electricity companies have been privatized 10 years ago. And they said they are like so happy now because they are freed from any political control. And so they can actually work better with the government now that they are out of its control. So it's kind of maybe a side effect of privatization and it may be a little bit like instrumental, but that actually may be an option. I mean, that's the issue, especially in India, where political control over urban development is really everywhere. That, I mean, I don't know if it's the solution, but I would say that managing to maybe get water utilities networks maybe out of the political realm may be a lead, but that's, I mean, it raises other questions, obviously.
Okay, I'm going to give the legendary Bob Dubinsky the last word. I think many people here know Bob. He's been a great supporter of this program. He's really been a great supporter of trying to keep urban issues and housing, importantly housing, which often gets pushed off the agenda, on everybody's radar screen here in Washington. He's done it for a very long time, and so it's an honor to turn the final word over to Bob.
You're very nice. It is very hard to keep it on the agenda, I must say. I think this has been a terrific session, and I've really learned a lot, and I got very stimulated by these presentations and also the commenters. I thought it was really very good. I have a few impressions which I'll leave you with, but I'm not sure I can add a lot of substance to what's been said. I first would also like to thank Nancy Leahy on my right here for all the work she's done in putting this together, and Allison Garland. Book here is just terrific and a real contribution to the literature in the field and represents obviously a lot of hard work on your part. Thank you, Allison. I guess the thing that struck me most was what Blair brought up and a lot of other people brought up, and that's sort of the informal sector and the people that live in the informal sector and the poor, and the fact that we who are academics or bureaucrats maybe don't know very much about them and what they really need and what they want. And I was really struck by Caleb's presentation just because of the fact that the poor really sort of know what they need and want in terms of the residential housing, but we as bureaucrats and planners don't want that for them. We want something else for them, and I think that's really unfortunate. I mean, in a middle-class context, you have developers go out and build middle-class housing for people, and they design the housing to the specifications of the buyers, what they want. We don't do that with poor people. We sort of tell them what they ought to have. And I think the emphasis on the fact that the house is more than a residential house, it's a place where you can earn a living. It's a place, as you say, where you can rent out rooms. It's maybe a place where you can gain some investment out of it. I just think we need to pay more attention to that, and I think it's really important. And I think the point of the fact that we don't like the poor, or a lot of people don't like the poor in particular, I guess you hear about this a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, to accept the fact that the poor are living in these cities, they're going to live there for the rest of their lives and their children's lives, they're a part of the community, but government and maybe donors don't really reach out the arm as much as they should to say, we're here to help you and we want you to stay and we're going to put you on the map and we're going to help you get a job. And so I think there probably needs to be a lot more emphasis on that. I'm glad to see that young people are really interested in urban development and housing. I think, at least in the United States, there's sort of been a period of time where that got off the radar, and I hope you will continue in these fields and you'll make the contributions that you're making. I was really sort of shocked by what Namish said about the data. I mean, I knew the data was terrible. We all know the data is terrible, but we also have this parallel activity now where we're doing results-based programming. Well, how are we doing results-based programming if we don't know what the results are, and we don't have a good base, and we don't have longitudinal data? So I guess I end up being sort of cynical about, what are we going to do with this results-based programming, and is that going to be an excuse to do not very good programming, or is it really going to contribute to better assistance? And I guess I would disagree with Tim a little bit here as my sort of final comment. We're very much involved in trying to help shape the so-called post-2015 Millennium Development Agenda. We've had the Millennium Development Goals that the United Nations adopted and all the countries adopted. Those expire in 2015. We're now talking about a new set of goals. And the International Housing Coalition, a lot of other people who we talk to are very much interested in having an urban goal or an urban target, but something that would identify urbanization in cities as an important objective of foreign assistance. And we're meeting a lot of resistance. We've talked about different things. We talked about an urban goal, we've talked about a slum goal, we've talked about a housing goal. But I think at this stage of time, our capability and our effectiveness is pretty weak. Now, anybody here who's interested in supporting something of that nature, I think hopefully would join with us and try to lobby and advocate for some sort of identification of city improvement and urbanization and helping the growing number of urban poor people develop a new and better life. So I guess I'm somewhat, at this point, somewhat cynical about whether we're going to be able to do this, but the game is not over yet. We have another 6 or 8 months or a year, and hopefully a lot of people who are interested in cities and in helping the urban poor will rise to the occasion. I just think this was really an interesting and thought-provoking day, and thank you all very much.
Thank you.